Hey, welcome to the conversation. My name is Kyle, and we are at the First Colony Church of Christ in Sugar Land, Texas. If you don't know where that is, you might not be from Texas, or you might be from somewhere else. You might be from somewhere else on the planet. We've got people from all over the planet watching us. We are a suburb of Houston, Texas. And I'm glad that you've joined me. I'm glad that you've found your way here wherever you are. I'm glad that you joined this little community. I want to give you a teaser for the rest of the conversation. Today's passage from 1 Thessalonians Chapter 2, verses 1 through 12 is one of the passages in the New Testament that I just have to say it kind of makes me a little jealous. I don't know if that's the right word. That might be a little strong. Angry might be the right word, but I think it's a little too strong. But somewhere between anger and jealousy, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12 really does that to me. You better hang on. I'll tell you why in a few minutes. Today is one of those rare days where I've double booked myself. I had to do that. So while I'm teaching here on the conversation, I'm also downstairs on our campus teaching live and in person, which, to give you a little secret here, this is a pre-recorded conversation. It was the only way that I could do it. This is rare. It rarely ever happens, but I don't want you to go anywhere. Next week I'll be back live, but stay right here. I want to tell you in just a few minutes why this passage today kind of evokes some feelings of jealousy in me. I got a book review for you, or at least a book recommendation. This is a book by Tony Reinke called Competing Spectacles. Competing Spectacles. Tony Reinke is an author. He's written 5 or 6 books. He works for desiringgod.org. It's a ministry of John Piper. He is one of the editors and writers for that website. This book is fantastic. It is an unbelievable resource. In fact, I probably should have recommended this to you at the start of our streaming options when we were all stuck at home a year ago, because since we've been stuck at home since the beginning of the lockdown and the stay-at-home orders last year in 2020, we have, if you're like me, you've been inundated with things to look at on your screen. It's really outrageous when I go to visit a website and there are pop-ups and questions and people want to send me notifications. That is constant in most websites. There are 1,000 bits of data every 3 or 4 minutes competing for my attention, and I know that they are competing for your attention too. This book, Competing Spectacles by Tony Reinke, addresses that in the life of a believer. It really helps us navigate a digital landscape where we are being completely immersed in digital spectacles, things to look at, things to watch, things that want our attention. And this is specifically in the digital world, although there are others, but Reinke specifically talks about how this really affects believers. What's interesting about this, and you might think this, is that he would lean more towards asceticism and just completely walking away from spectacles, but he doesn't do that at all. I want to give you a quote here from the book. Biblical ethics, Reinke writes, is not about simply avoiding corrupting things, but learning to see and enjoy and embrace eternal things that are true, that truly bring meaning and purpose and joy into our lives. He writes in the book that we are hardwired to look at awesome things because we are image bearers. In fact, we're going to talk about what it means to be an image bearer in just a few minutes. Because we are image bearers, we are drawn to glory and glorious events and spectacles that are larger than life. And those the designs of the enemy play to that because of our sinful nature, and we find ourselves being immersed. Not necessarily, there are some things that are really bad for us that we spend way too much time watching, but sometimes there are time wasters. So in any event, I want to highly recommend this book to you, Competing Spectacles. It's a little bitty thin book by Tony Reinke. You need to buy this today. I think it costs $10 at Amazon. I can't even remember, but it is a great book, especially as we maybe come out of these stay-at-home orders and maybe come out of this. Well, of course, we're out of the stay-at-home orders, but as we come out of this mentality of just staying home and being drawn to a screen, this may help us navigate, at least at the end of this cycle, how we need to access good, healthy things that will build us up in faith. So, Competing Spectacles by Tony Reinke. I absolutely encourage you to purchase this book and add it to your library. All right, we are in 1 Thessalonians Chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, and I told you a minute ago, I'm going to give you a reason why in just a few minutes why this passage puts me in the target area somewhere between jealousy and anger. And it's hard to read it. It's even hard to read it now. We are in a teaching series here on Sunday mornings on The Conversation called Steady. It's really a great series for me. We are taking a survey look through 1 Thessalonians because 1 Thessalonians is a case study in encouragement. I've said this last week. I said this in a promo video. I'm going to say it again. About 12 times in this letter, Paul and Silas and Timothy, the three authors of this letter, sought to remind the recipients of things that they knew to be true. The authors would write phrases like "you know," or "you remember," or "you were witnesses," and they did this about 12 times. In fact, there are a few of them in today's passage. This idea of "you know what we were like," "you remember how we were," "you were witnesses to these things." The reason why that Paul writes this letter to the church in God at Thessalonica, that's from 1 Thessalonians Chapter 1, verse 1, is that their church was born into a suffering experience. If you read the experience of Paul's church planting time in Thessalonica in Acts chapter 17, you get a real clear look that Paul was actually forced out of the city because there was an uproar in the city because of what Paul was saying. There's a good reason for that. We know that from this passage and others that we're going to read today, that Paul labored day and night for the people in Thessalonica. He worked, in other words, he worked with his hands. He did not seek to be a financial burden to this church, but he was receiving assistance from the previous city he had just visited, the city of Philippi. So he wasn't necessarily averse to receiving assistance. He just did not want to do that in Thessalonica. And he spent time, from what we can gather, working with his hands. He was a leather worker or a tent maker or something in that arena. And because of the language that he worked all night and all day and into the night, that he spent a lot of time practicing his trade there, selling his wares. And it seems, and this is kind of cool, that he originally shared the gospel message among the marketplace. Maybe in a trade guild or some of the trade guilds. He was there doing this 18 hours a day maybe. And that's where he had his initial conversations about Jesus. Eventually he finds himself in the synagogue teaching, but by the time he finds himself there in the synagogue, the city is already in an uproar, and it caused some of his companions in Thessalonica to be arrested and had to post bail. Paul and Timothy and Silas, at least Paul was forced out of the city and went to Athens from there. This was serious business. And the reason why, and I said this last week, you can check out last week's video in the playlist. Thessalonica was a free city in the Roman Empire, which meant that they were free of control of the Roman emperor. They governed themselves. They printed and coined their own money. They did not have any stationed imperial troops in the city. They were governed by a council, and they were going to do whatever they had to do to stay a free city. They paid homage and allegiance to the emperor. They had a statue to Augustus, a temple to Augustus. Some of their admiration for the emperor kind of got bled and melded into a local cult, a local pagan cult. So in some regard, the people of Thessalonica actually deified the Roman emperor. So when Paul shows up in this city of about 100,000 people, and he's showing up in the marketplace, and he's talking about Jesus as the one true Lord. In fact, he calls him this in the letter. This gets people a little fired up. All the people in high places get a little frustrated at Paul, because if he's going to come to Thessalonica and claim there is another person, another emperor, another God, another Lord, this could put their status at being a free city in serious jeopardy. It would put them under the thumb of the emperor, so they get kicked out. So Paul writes this letter from the city of Corinth later, about 18 months later. He is in Corinth. Timothy shows up in Corinth from Thessalonica, tells them what's going on, and Paul has to write to the church there to settle them down. Their departure was in haste, it was abrupt, and it was a little scandalous. So the suffering that continued for the believers, because there were people still in Thessalonica that believed in Jesus, that proclaimed Jesus, that and the city itself was causing difficulty and hardship, mental stress. That some of the language in First Thessalonians indicates that, but also economic stress. This was a pressure cooker of suffering and difficulty, and Paul is writing them to hold on, to stay steady. Remember what you know about Jesus. Remember how we experienced suffering. Imitate us. So that's where we are. We covered that last week from chapter 1. This week we're going to be in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And I'm going to read this from the NIV. I hope you follow along. Here we go. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. You know, brothers, there's the first phrase here. You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not a failure. We had previously suffered and been insulted in Philippi. As you know, there's the next phrase, but with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in spite of strong opposition. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as men approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please men, but God, who tests our hearts. You know, there it is again. You know, we never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. This is not the kind of masks that we wear, all right? Little humor, it's okay. Verse 5, you know, we never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from men, not from you or anyone else. As apostles of Christ, we could have been a burden to you, but we were gentle among you, like a mother caring for her little children. We loved you. We loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well, because you had become so dear to us. Surely you remember, another variation of that phrase, you know, surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel of God to you. Let's finish this up from verse 10. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed. For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and into his glory. There you are, the first 12 verses of chapter 2. And let me tell you why this passage just gets to me. This passage is really a template. It's really a template of how Paul discipled the Thessalonians, how he shared the gospel with the Thessalonians. He talks about his experience before he got there. He talks about his experience teaching them. He talks about his dedication to them, all for them to, at the end of this in verse 12, we'll talk about in depth in just a couple of minutes, all in order to encourage and comfort and urge them to live lives worthy of God. He invested his time and his money and his energy into these people. And this is why this passage gets to me. Because I read this and I realize that I never had one person pour into my life like this for the sake of the gospel. Now, I grew up in a church. We had a nice community. We have a great community here at First Colony. I'm not talking about a community experience of believers. I'm talking about a walking beside someone. I never had that. In fact, I don't want to be too personal in this conversation, but about 10 years ago, I experienced a pretty severe crisis in my own faith There was no moral failure in my life or in any of the lives of my family members. I just couldn't understand what it meant to love Jesus anymore, and was close to walking away from all of it. And I learned later, the Lord was so merciful to me. He nurtured me. I feel like in some regard, in some ways, how Paul writes in Galatians, that no person taught him the gospel, that he received his gospel straight from Jesus. I'm not going to pretend that I'm in the same arena as Paul, but I feel like in the past, after that crisis of faith that I experienced 10 years ago and the subsequent 3 or 4 years, Jesus was so merciful to me and nurtured me and allowed me to, it gave me space to learn the gospel, to read good information, to find answers to hard questions. And I find myself here when I read a passage like 1 Thessalonians 2 thinking, what would I have been like? What would I have been like if someone like Paul had poured into my life, had invested time and space and energy and intervened in my personal life for the sake of the gospel? So I look at this and I get real jealous of the Thessalonians. They had someone who stayed with them and labored with them, all to share with them about the resurrection of Jesus. This passage, it's like fireworks go off when I read it. I read this experience from Paul and I think, this is amazing. And then it becomes something very different. It becomes, am I pouring my time into someone to teach in a micro level, not a macro level, but a micro level, because I am a minister here at this church, but I'm talking in a very specific way. Am I pouring my life into people, investing in them and sharing with them the gospel? So it's a two-way street here. I want to show you a couple of things here about this experience and how it encouraged the Thessalonians, and what Paul meant when he said that he did all this to encourage and comfort and urge them. This is in verse 12. Encourage, comfort, and urge them to live lives worthy of the gospel. This is really Paul's mission statement. He is here, and he is not just here, but he's in Philippi and Corinth and Athens, in Lystra and Derbe. He's in all of these cities to encourage and comfort and urge people to live lives worthy of God. We're going to get to that in just a minute. I want to pull out a couple of things here that I think are of great interest here as we read through this passage, that puts a little meat on the bones here of what 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 is really trying to tell us. First of all, in disciple making, Paul is not really telling a personal story. It's telling here, it's that Paul says that the gospel that he is telling the Thessalonians was God's gospel. In verse 3, it's called God's gospel, and even in verse 8, it's the gospel of God. He's not telling his story. He's telling the story of God. He is a messenger of something else. He's not making this up. And in fact, by saying these words, he's actually saying that you can verify my message here with your fellow citizens in Thessalonica, but even in citizens in the other cities. There was a lot of cross-pollination here. Thessalonica was on a major Roman road called the Via Egnatia, and there were people that were coming in and out of Thessalonica that were going to Philippi and Athens, and even Corinth. This was a major thoroughfare, and there were constantly people that were walking this that would go from Philippi to Thessalonica. They knew what Paul was saying in other places. And by him saying this, he's saying you can validate, you can fact check that what I'm saying is not fake news. This is absolutely legitimate. I have said the same thing here. Fake news, by the way, is another little bit of humor. What I've said here, I've said somewhere else, because this is not my story. I'm just telling it. I'm telling it on behalf of God. This is how he opens this. Remember that I told you a story that belonged to the creator of the world. So there's that. The second thing that I think is of note here is Paul spends a lot of time talking about his personal conduct. He's talking about how they were insulted in Philippi. There was strong opposition there. I'm reading from the text here. He talks about that he never used flattery. They were gentle like a mother. They were They were molding like a father. He uses some parental examples here, but he talks about them not being a burden on the Thessalonians, and that he invested his life there. What we find here is that the conduct of a disciple maker and the content of the disciple maker are inextricably connected. Paul's influence would have been wasted had he lived in a different way. And in a way to encourage the Thessalonians, he's saying, you know what I said and you know how I lived. I came to you from a difficult situation, and I left you in a difficult situation, but I was certain that I was never a burden on you. Another thing here that we find in this disciple-making template here in 1 Thessalonians Chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, is something that I like to call God in the present tense. Man, that'll preach. God in the present tense here. There are 3 times in this passage where Paul writes about God doing things in the present tense. And remember, this matters. Language matters. The Greek language had all sorts of nuances and inflections on how to write words, more so than what the English language does, which I think is really the beauty of why God reserved or waited, as Paul wrote in Galatians 4, the fullness of time, why he opted to allow the advent of Jesus and the expanse of the gospel to happen in the first century, because the Greek language is so communicable. So when Paul writes things in the present tense, there is a reason he does that. It's not just colloquialism. Can I say that right? Colloquialism. He's actually saying things about God that are dynamic and that are happening in real time. So I want to show you this. The first is in verse 4. I love this. In verse 4, there's a couple of things about a couple of different verbs here. He says that in verse 4, we speak as men approved by God. That verb approved is actually in the perfect tense, which means that Paul viewed his approval by God as steadfast. It will never change. But check this out. At the end of verse 4, he says that it is God who tests our hearts. He writes the word tests, the verb, in the present tense. So even though their approval is forever and ever, God is still testing the hearts of his messengers. The second part of this is it's in verse 10. He talks about the believers. In verse 10, he says, you are witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed. For some reason, that's translated as a past tense verb in the English language to help the phrasing, but in the Greek language, it's a present tense verb, which is really interesting for Paul. Paul is saying, you still believe. You are suffering now. You are in a difficult situation, but you are still believers. You are still believing. And the last part of this is in verse 12. The last part of this God in the present tense is that Paul is encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God. Check this out. Who calls? That's in the present tense. Who calls you into his kingdom and his glory. That this process of calling is a present, real-time, dynamic process of being called into something. And here we are in chapter 2, verse 12, the heart of Paul's disciple making. I've said this 2 or 3 times, and I feel like I'm going to keep saying it, that Paul's aim was to encourage, comfort, and urge the Thessalonians to live lives worthy of God. Now, I'm going to spend the rest of our time, we got about 5 minutes here, I'm going to spend the rest of our time talking about this, because when Paul writes that, he doesn't explain what that means. So it tells me that that phrase or that idea was something that he shared with the Thessalonians that did not require any other explanation. But it's a little bit of a cliffhanger, because what I think what our first reaction is to hearing a phrase like this is that Paul is emphasizing perfectionism, that in order to be worthy, you have to do things the right way. And we know that that's not true. that grace satisfies our need to earn our way into God's acceptance. Through the blood of Jesus, through the death and the resurrection of Jesus, you and I do not have to earn our acceptance by God. What it does do is it shifts that and makes us want to live the right way, right? We know that. But Paul doesn't say those things there. So we're going to do a little bit of theological investigation here in the last few minutes. So what does it mean for Paul to say that it was that he was trying to give them, or at least help them live lives worthy of God? I'm grabbing some of my notes over here, so don't let me alarm you here. I want to show you this. I want to go to a couple different passages. First, we're going to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. Powerful verse. I hope you find this in your Bible in time. If not, just listen to this. We're going to start in this is verse 18. And we who, with unveiled faces, all reflect the Lord's glory, are being transformed. Now, that's a key word. We are being transformed into his likeness with ever increasing glory. Into likeness is not really the right word there. If it's going to be translated according to the Greek and the Septuagint, that word should really be image, because this is where we're getting. All right. What does it mean to live lives worthy of God? Well, in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18, Paul says that our experience, and I'm going to show you this in a couple of places so we can know this is what Paul shared with the Thessalonians. Paul believed and taught that our experience as believers in Jesus meant that we were being transformed into the image of Jesus. We know that because in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, we find out that the image of the person Paul is talking about is actually Jesus. Listen to this. The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ. Listen to this. Who is the image of God. Now, where does this phrase come from, and why is this all of a sudden a part of Paul's thinking? Well, it actually comes from Genesis. You and I both know that when God created humanity, he created them specifically in the image of himself, in the image of God. This is from Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. Paul is using that phrase, the image of God, saying that whereas we are corruptible, we have been corrupted as image bearers. It is Jesus, the Son of God, in all of his perfection, who reclaimed humanity and uniquely fulfilled what it meant to be the image of God, and that we are being transformed into that. Now, let's go to one more place. Let's go to the book of Romans. We're going to go to Romans chapter 8. I hope you have your Bibles. We're going to get there pretty quick. It's easier to get there if you're on your phone, maybe. We're going to go to Romans chapter 8, verses 29 and 30. You will have heard this before. Listen to what Paul wrote in this letter about image. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. Paul wrote in Romans chapter 8, verse 29, that God predestined believers to be conformed into the image of Jesus. That is really our experience as Jesus followers, is that we have submitted ourselves, and God has allowed us to submit ourselves to this transformation. And this is a lifelong transformation. It's not complete until Jesus himself returns. So to find this phrase in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, that Paul's job as a disciple maker was to encourage and comfort and urge the Thessalonians to live lives worthy of God. What Paul is saying, and we pull this from some theological investigations from other passages in the New Testament, from 2 Corinthians and from Romans. And actually, he writes it again in Colossians chapter 1 when he talks about us being transferred into the kingdom, the kingdom of the Son that he loves. We find this nugget of teaching that says that for us to live lives worthy of God, we are part of that transformation. Paul never speaks of nor spoke of perfectionism. And it would be really disastrous for us to read into this that Paul is saying you got to do everything the right way. We believe, we obey because we believe, because we know the magnificence of Jesus' love for us, right? It's Galatians chapter 2, verse 21, where Paul said that the death of Jesus was an expression of Jesus' love for Paul. That's really where we are in 1 Thessalonians. Paul is writing to them to stay steady. They are in a process of transformation. And living lives worthy of God means that you are, and it's that present tense verb there. He is calling you now into his kingdom and into his glory. This is not something that's already been done, nor is it something that he's going to do later. He's doing it now. It is a dynamic calling. Let me close here by saying I want to encourage you to be steady. I want to encourage you to be steady. The experience of a believer is it's not easier today than it was for those in the first century, nor is it harder. I would dare say that our experiences are extremely familiar. We are pressured in a macro level and even in a micro level to stop, to cease and desist our conversations about Jesus, sometimes to our own peril, even in a cancel culture. That's where we are. And I want to encourage you to be steady. I want to encourage you and comfort you and urge you to live lives worthy of God. This is a great book. Hey, thanks so much for joining me here this week. I'm sorry about no Q&A here at the end, but we'll be back. We'll do an extended Q&A at the end of this. But if you have any questions, send me an email. Here's my email address, kyles@firstcolonychurch.org. Send me an email. We can chat. I've done that a lot. I've done that with several of you, and I'd be happy to hear from you. Thanks for joining me today in the conversation. Let's live lives worthy of God. Stay steady. Stay steady, believer. I'll see you here next week.